What's up, everybody? Thank you for tuning in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast live on GrandstandSportsNetwork.com. I'm Ryan Thomas coming to you live, and what a night it was. Last night, UFC 222 took place, Las Vegas, Nevada, a card that was, as I mentioned, a makeshift card in the previous episode of the podcast. Cyborg steps in on less than 4 weeks' notice. Yana Kunitskaya steps in on less than 4 weeks' notice. Frankie Edgar, coming off an actual camp for Max Holloway in a featherweight title fight, which was the supposed, main event, supposed to be the main event for UFC 222. He takes on Brian Ortega on short notice. So a makeshift card nonetheless, featuring some veteran names inside the sport: Kat Zingano, CB Dalloway, Hector Lombard, John Dodson, Andrei Arlovsky, Stefan Struve. A lot of fights that featured some veteran names and some prospects. Mackenzie Dern, Ashley Yoder. That bout was a very good bout. I'll get to that in a little bit. Sean O'Malley making his pay-per-view debut on the card as well. So all in all, was it a great night of fights? Was it worth $64.99? No, which is why I didn't pay the $64.99. There's something called YouTube, where if you type in UFC 222, somebody's filming it somewhere. So, hate to admit to be that guy, but that's what I did, this past, and it wasn't even the full fights. It's just highlights, clips. I didn't really get to watch the full fights yet, which I will when they post them on UFC Fight Pass, but it wasn't the full fights. It was more so the highlights and clips, but nonetheless, I want to dive right into it. So let's talk about the main event first. Cyborg versus Yana Kunitskaya, as I mentioned, a fight that came together in relative short order, as Yana Kunitskaya, the Invicta women's bantamweight champion at 135 pounds, obviously, moves up to 145 to take on the current reigning, defending, undisputed UFC featherweight champion, Cris Cyborg, UFC female women's bantamweight champion. And the odds were heavily stacked against her. Had Yana Kunitskaya won this fight, it would have been probably the biggest upset in mixed martial arts history. So, did I expect her to win? No. Did I expect Cyborg to run right through her? Yes. But let's talk about the fight. Let's talk about the main event first. Usually I save the main event for last, but there's some talking points here that I want to bring up. So everybody, fan-wise, fans around the world, mixed martial arts fans, they talk about how Cyborg is the best. She's the best female fighter of all time. She's a destroyer. She's like the Mike Tyson of women's MMA. And in some respects, I agree with that. I agree with that argument. But in most, I don't. And the reason why I don't, in some respects, is because each fight is different. She's fighting her opponent. Each opponent that she's fought in this unprecedented, undefeated run has offered her different challenges. And for Yana Kunitskaya to be one of the biggest underdogs, probably the biggest underdog in UFC history, and to land a single leg takedown in the sport of mixed martial arts, which is so rare. If you go back, you could watch 50 UFC pay-per-views in a row from years past, dating back to 2007, 2002, 2001. Go back to the beginning of the Zuffa-owned UFC. And you will not see someone land a single leg takedown on their opponent. You just won't see it. You just won't. So the fact that Yana Kunitskaya was able to land a single leg takedown on Cris Cyborg, who, as the fans say, and they're not wrong, is the best female fighter of all time, that shows that, to date, yes, she is the best female fighter of all time. She has an undefeated streak of 10 years. She's dispatched virtually everyone she's ever fought in devastating fashion, most in the first round. So definitely, she is the best female fighter on planet Earth. But people are failing to realize is that she has holes in her game. She has massive holes in her game, holes that a pure grappler could easily exploit. A pure wrestler inside the women's 145-pound or bantamweight, if they keep throwing these bantamweight challengers at her, could definitely exploit. Now, it's not Cyborg's fault that she's fighting these women and beating them. The UFC she can only fight the people that the UFC give her, right? So she's taking these challenges, winning these fights, doing just crazy things inside the cage since she signed with the UFC, putting out true championship level performances back to back against Holm and Kunitsukaya, and then obviously the first fight with Tanya Evinger. But even in the Evinger fight, if I go back to the beginning, even with the Evinger fight, the Tanya Evinger fight, it took her a long time to finish her, and Tanya Evinger was begging for a way out. There was never a moment in time where I thought, oh, Tanya Evinger can win this fight. There just wasn't. She was so behind in terms of her skills compared to Cyborg's skills. It made her look like a novice boxer compared to a pro boxer. I mean, there was a huge disparity between the skills of Cyborg and the skills of Tanya Evinger. And Cyborg took a long time to finish her. That can be credited to a lot of things, the toughness of Tanya Evinger, but realistically, she was begging for a way out. She wasn't fighting back. She was just moving back, and Cyborg couldn't catch her. It was a very strange fight. Never saw a title fight at the very least, that had that type of back and forth, one person going after one person, rather than a back and forth. It was just one fighter going after another fighter the entire time, and she just couldn't finish her. Ultimately, she did, I believe, in the third or fourth round, if I'm not mistaken. So I actually don't even... Yeah, she did finish her. I do remember that. So, and then there's the fight with Holly Holm. She's down on the scorecards 2-0 to start, and she was able to come back in dominant fashion, winning the last 3 rounds of that fight. No doubt about it, she won that fight. And then you move her on to this fight against Yana Kunitsukaya, who has intangibles, who did some decent things in the beginning, but let Cyborg dictate the pace of the fight. Take notes, ladies. Anytime you let Cyborg dictate the pace of a fight, she is going to win. If you move back, she will win. People have to, the fighters, her next few opponents, have to close the distance, avoid the big shots, and grapple. Force her to fight off her back or fight against the cage. Those are the ways to beat her. She is beatable. No fighter is unbeatable. Every fighter has an off night. Even John Jones had an off night against Alexander Gustafsson. George St. Pierre has had off nights. Anderson Silva has had off nights. Every great champion in this sport or challenger has had an off night. So that day is coming, I believe, but someone needs to raise their hand and say, I'm next. I'm the girl that can beat her, because she is beatable. She has some massive holes in her game, and I truly believe that although she is the best female fighter of all time, she is beatable. Much like Jose Aldo. You look at Jose Aldo, for years, Jose Aldo was dominating guys. For years, Jose Aldo was finishing fighters, sometimes in the simplest of ways, with leg kicks, with knees. Just one strike would finish his opponent. Eventually, he was figured out. Whether it was with Conor McGregor or the Chad Mendes fights, take Jose Aldo into deep waters or counter and move, and he will lose. And that is what has happened to Jose Aldo. The Max Holloway fights, you look at the Max Holloway fights, Max Holloway fought Jose Aldo a mile a minute, throwing 3 times as many punches as Aldo. That's another way to beat someone. 3 times the output. Cardio king, or cardio queen in this case, is needed for Cyborg. Great performance by Cyborg. I'm not taking anything away from her. I think she's a truly great fighter. She's a legend. She deserves to have this stage that she's on. She deserves to get the respect that she's been given pre-fight. But once you're in there, throw that all away. It's time to go. It's not time to, high five or shake hands or hug or anything like that. It's fight time. Let's go. Yana Kunitsukaya, Holly Holm have come up short. Tanya Evinger has come up short as well. It's time for one of these ladies to step up and say, I am the girl to beat her. Dana White, the UFC president, is looking to set up a fight between Cyborg and Raquel Pennington. I'm very excited for that fight. I think that's a great, or not a Cyborg and Raquel Pennington. I'm sorry, Cyborg and Amanda Nunes. I'm excited for that fight. Great fight. Champion versus champion. It will sell, but a 135-pound fighter, a champion at 135 pounds, has proven to not be enough to beat Cyborg. Not once, twice, with Holm and Yana Kunitskaya. I know Amanda Nunes is her own breed. She is a truly amazing fighter. She's a true finisher, true warrior. But let's put her in there with a true 145-pounder. She is the 145-pound champion in Cyborg. Cyborg is the featherweight champion. Putting her up against these ladies that are in a weight class under her, she has a huge, significant size advantage in these fights, and it diminishes her greatness. Putting her in there with women that are much smaller than her. It's the reason why Miesha Tate never fought her. It's the reason why Ronda Rousey never fought her. Time to put her in there with a 145er. In my humble opinion, it's time to do that. Megan Anderson is out there. There's fighters out there in Invicta. There's fighters out there all around the world that I feel the UFC, since instituting this women's 145-pound weight class, has grossly robbed the weight class of potential. Really, the only true 145-pounder in the weight class is the champion. Everyone that has fought the champion is not a true 145-pounder. I'm not taking anything away from Cyborg here. As I mentioned from the top, you can only fight the fighters that they put in front of you. And she did everything she could to win her fights. More power to her. What's next? Probably a fight with Amanda Nunes. I think that's a good fight, but does it make the most sense? Dollars and cents wise, yes, which is the era that we live in now in the UFC, WME, IMG era. But in terms of competitive, in terms of competition, competitiveness, the sport, Megan Anderson, a true badass at 145 pounds, needs to be in there with Cyborg. She's young, she's dangerous, and she's hungry. Are these girls hungry enough to beat Cyborg? And Amanda Nunes, they're going to try to make that fight as soon as possible. Amanda Nunes needs time. Amanda Nunes needs time not to go up from 135 to 145 with just simple weight. She needs to get bigger and stronger to go against Cyborg. That's what she needs. And it's going to take a lot of time, no doubt about it, but the UFC doesn't want to spend the time on this, on that. They don't want to create time for Nunes to get bigger like they did with GSP and Bisping. That's what ultimately that fight did. There was supposed to be, Bisping and GSP was supposed to be in July, and it ended up happening in November. That's a good 4 months, 4 solid months, where they want this fight in July, should be in November. We're here in March, should be in November, but they'll rush this fight because they want the money. They like the champion versus champion matches, and that's that. So, great main event. Yana Kunitskaya did all she could. Cyborg was dominant, but the next lady, I'm talking about the next challenger, needs to watch that fight, take notes, and apply it. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was part 1 of tonight's show of the Thomas Take Sports podcast. Be right back to wrap up the co-main event, Frankie Edgar versus Brian Ortega. Take care, everybody.